The separation of talent and skill is one of the greatest misunderstood concepts. There's no easy way around it. No matter how talented you are, your talent is going to fail you if you're not skilled.
Hey everyone, welcome to the premiere episode of Skill Science, where we deconstruct player skills, mechanics, and techniques. My name is Dr. Raj. I'm a doctor of physiotherapy. I'm a movement, quote, scientist. Some people may laugh at that, but it's a real thing. And I'm joined today by my partner in crime. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hello, I'm PD Webb. I am a scout, writer, basketball coach, trainer, movement curious person who is here to try to illuminate the things that I've learned on my process of trying to teach movement skills better and trying to learn as much as possible about development, but also as a long-term fan of your work.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to spend with me, and hopefully something. The plan here is to have this be a weekly segment where we talk about a specific skill of a specific player and really dive deep within a quick 10 to 15 minute period. But the key here is useful information that people can translate into their own game, whether it's a coach, whether it's a player, to be able to apply, right? That's really the key for both of us from what we've talked about, is making this a useful podcast, not just throwing out jargon and making ourselves feel good about ourselves because we know the jargon.
Yeah, as a person who has, I think in the past 5 years, gone from knowing literally nothing about this to being here, I think that for me, having something that has been so valuable in my life and my understanding, in my scouting, in my coaching, and just my general basketball experience, making this as easy to wherever you are on your journey, whether it's a person who may be curious, to a person who may be agnostic, to a person who may be an adopter, to up the academic scales, to have a piece for everyone, to have an access point for everyone. That is my primary focus, because I still have a lot to learn about this, and I would love to walk away with each one of these, both with more questions.
So with all that in mind, today we're going to talk about is Grizzlies guard Ja Morant's landing mechanics. So we all get very excited about his leaping ability, right? Reportedly 44 plus inch vertical hops. We all love the highlights, but what goes up also must come down. In Ja's case, oftentimes it's not in a safe manner. We've all seen probably the highlights. I think there's one dunk where he really, that knee really got caught under him and it kind of pulled back, and everyone was very concerned about his landing mechanics. And oftentimes what I see with him it's a risk reward where he's going up and he's not really taking into account the safety of his landing position. And so he comes down with kind of, his legs are everywhere in the air, which then influences his landing. So there's that pre-planning phase. And then he comes down, and you often see him coming down single leg in various positions, whether it's on the heel and with that leg straight. And so those are all, or they have been, high risk positions for him in the past. I think we've seen some improvement in that, and we'll get into that. So PD, what are you seeing in that regard?
There's most definitely a development. Ja at Murray State was much worse as a leaper, in that I think that for 2-foot jumpers, you sort of imply a degree of stability, because there is a moment of leaping where you are guaranteed to be stable, just to set 1 foot down and the other in the same place. And with Ja, his legs just flew all over, and he would have some of the most jarring looking landings. And I don't think you have to have multiple degrees to be that does not look pleasant to go that high in the air and then land with a straight knee. And I think that more often than not, during his draft year, you'd be I don't know how this works long term. This particular problem has plagued many a high flying guard. It's not necessarily something that's really taught to young players, both in their prior curriculum or even necessarily in college. So, some players, when they get to the NBA, when they get development training, really do get it quickly. And other players have had career or season or, serious alterations to their bodies just because they got up so high and before they, their jumping reach was so much higher than their jumping grasp, to put it in more colloquialism.
Yeah, definitely. No, and I think even if you just, let's say you Google search YouTube and you look up jumping mechanics versus landing mechanics, you're probably like 10-to-1 ratio in terms of what is covered and what is not. And so, but the reality is when it comes to player health and safety and long-term kind of development, it's really the landing mechanics that are going to put you at significant risk, for injury. And so I think first and foremost for me, when we talk about landing mechanics with Ja, I think that was really the concern is, right, like you said, PD, is that can this individual sustain that type of play for that long of time? A similar guy I looked at in that regard was Blake Griffin when he came into the league, is can he sustain some of that landing impact through his body as well? Zion's another one. Zion, I thought, was a good case study because they actually did a pretty good job with his landing mechanics his first year in New Orleans. He has other issues that I think we all know of, whether it comes to some of the weight issues and being able to keep that off. And so, which influences his injury risk and his health factors. But I think there's certainly been more of a shift towards understanding landing mechanics and how they influence player health. And I think even just early in this year with Ja, I've seen some very good signs with his landing in terms of getting himself into a good landing shape prior to making contact with the ground. What have you been seeing, or what are some other examples you've seen, specific examples of players who you've kind of seen develop their landing mechanics?
I mean, the biggest one for me is probably Westbrook. He played in the same style, but I think that he got a lot more into coping mechanisms about not taking bad landings. There's one of the videos that actually got me really interested in this topic was a video from Coleman Ayers about Russ's coping mechanisms with landing, not taking bad falls, learning to land on his hip, learning to really manipulate his landing so that you didn't have any outside of his frame. None of the one leg out, one leg straight up and down, body weight tilting back, that I would say, like you say, catastrophic landing. This might actually be a good time to sort of encircle the terms that we're going to use today and talk about sort of the key ideas that pertain to landing mechanics before we get too far into individual case study and Ja specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I mean, the first thing we often talk about, right, is what is a kind of, planning your landing. What is an unplanned landing, right? So that ability, and where does that stem from? Some of that is the term we talked about, which is proprioception, right? And so that is going to be your body's unconscious awareness of itself in space, right? Your brain has to determine where your body parts are, which is based on certain cells in your joints called proprioceptors, which then give feedback back to your brain. And and then that also combines with your balance, your vestibular system, which is your inner ear system, which again is like a GPS system for your brain to allow you to understand what the heck your body is doing, and then what adjustments it has to make in terms of movement, in terms of muscular activation, to then, it dictates following action.
I think proprioception is one of the most essential terms, and to this entire field, really. And it's a thing that makes sense. It's just we don't really have a word for it. In the popular idea is just knowing where you are and your body knowing where you are.
Yep.
You can sort of test this yourself by putting a blindfold on and trying to walk down a hallway or through parts of your apartment. If you have a mental picture of where your arm is right now in space, it's how you can make movements and gestures and stuff. And that gets easier and harder. I mean, we all remember growing. I grew like 7 inches in my teens, and I would fall going up and down stairs because I was unsure of how long my legs were. I also had terrible balance, which certainly didn't contribute, but that's another proprioceptive faculty. So I think that's a really essential term, and it can be difficult, as you would imagine, to jump 40 plus inches in the air, know exactly where you are, be sort of bumped by somebody, and then land in what we call a good landing. What would you say is the textbook definition of a good landing?
So for me, good landing, I typically look at 3 mechanical components. The first is, I think this is for fans, 3 things to look at. 1, two leg versus single leg landing. Because a 2-leg landing will decrease force versus single leg. Now it's obviously you can't always go into a 2-leg landing, right? It's just much harder to get into that position, especially when you're jumping with certain contortions or into traffic. After that point, I'm looking at hip and knee flexion. Flexion means bend in the knee and in the hip, because the straighter those joints are, the more force is now going into your body. And then thirdly is also what we call ankle flexion, ankle bending as well. And again, part of that is going to be, again, how much weight or force that foot is absorbing based on how much bend you have into that ankle. And then also kind of as a subset of that is, are you landing heel first or are you landing forefoot, front of the foot first? So we know all the research shows that a heel landing significantly increases force through your body. So landing is all about how are you controlling the amount of force that's now going up through your body.
Yeah, that's, I think, from a layman perspective, it's landing on balance and then landing like architecturally solid so that no one element of your body carries too much weight. And like the ideas of ankle flexion, knee flexion, and hip flexion are that like if one area has to carry all of the weight in the same way that like if support beams fail for a house, like it goes on to another area, and then if that happens for long enough or too much weight happens, something bad happens, the house falls over or collapses onto itself. And it's the same thing for landing mechanics. It's that like ideally there is a proportion for everyone of how much ankle handles something, how much hip handles something, how much knee handles something, and what the relationship between them is. And really like a good landing is just a sound landing where the landing is not harder for the player than it has to be, or is not more complicated than it has to be. And that is something that, totally makes sense. That, if you have to lock your knee and land, I'm in my 30s now, so like that alone just sounds like hell. But, like that's a bad time. If you don't have the ability to bend your ankles and your knees and hip have to carry it, obviously there's going to be a long-term cost. So I think that, having that idea of like what we expect a good landing to be, what we expect a bad landing to be, is really important, because I think that, once we have those ideas down, we can talk about why, like, obviously everyone would like to have a good landing every time, but why these things don't happen, how you can be a world-class athlete and be able to manipulate through space, weave in and out of traffic, duck the world's best athletes and then fly through the air to finish inside a little orange cylinder is obviously something that seems pretty easy considering all of the advantages that NBA players have. So why do bad landings happen?
And there's multiple things. One is not taking into consideration before the jump starts is the risk reward of a jump, right? Should I, an individual like Ja, who can jump 44 inches, really try to jump over Kevin Love, right? And what happens if I don't succeed in that, right? You're opening yourself up to risk, right? And so that to me is the first stage in that. It's setting yourself up for a poor landing by making a poor decision to jump into a situation that has many, many open variables that can then impact how I'm going to land. And then secondly, for me, is once you're in the air, it's what we just talked about. It's that proprioceptive ability to be able to then control your body in a motion that's then setting you up for that balanced, stable landing that you spoke about. And then thirdly is the actual neuromuscular in this case wasn't a term that we define. Neuromuscular essentially is how your brain controls your muscles activation. It's kind of that connection between the wiring, the nerves, and the muscle activation. So once your body hits the ground in that landing position, it's your brain and your movement pattern then kind of taking over that preparation aspect. So those three things to me are really the three kind of major things I'm looking at: pre, during the jump, and then as you actually start the landing phase.
So what are the consequences of taking bad landings?
I mean, it's just, I think we mentioned this earlier. It's the fact that you're going to put more force through your body. You're opening yourself up to a lot of risk, right? Whether that means, an overt injury where like you twist something or whatever it is, or you just really land poorly. But more so than that, I would say it's this repetitive force through your body that then leads to increased wear and tear on those joints. So over time, you're wondering, man, why am I more sore all the time, right? Why is my leg hurting all the time? Stuff like that, especially if you're trying to have a long-term career. And this applies to anyone, from a younger age to an older age, whether it's Ja or a kid who's 8 to 10 years old. Over time, that increased level of force will catch up to you.
I think that's really valuable because I think the popular conception that I was, that I walked into is that knee injuries are a thing that happen. Like an ACL is torn because of an event rather than it being a natural result of systems that like the movements, the movement abilities failed, the supportive muscular muscles, didn't do their jobs in this particular instance, that it was sort of just like, yeah, these are quote freak accidents. And I think that like, yes, it is the one time that the levee breaks. But more importantly, though, like that's not particularly educational. Like these things happen, the levee breaks because of poor maintenance, because of poor architecture, and that through that lens, seeing it as a systematic and gradual process allows us to train around it. So let's go back to Ja's, his draft process into his rookie year. We have a player who is extraordinarily electric, flies off the ground, has landing issues, and I wouldn't say is showing the signs, but definitely has a lot of the indicators of a player who this will be a consistent medical problem, consistent, a burden on his game, on the amount of minutes he's allowed to play, on how back-to-backs work. If you were trying to develop a safer landing mechanic, what does that process look like, and what is it that is being developed first?
Yeah, so the first thing I think when I'm developing a new movement, it's you almost want to intentionally over exaggerate what you're looking for. Well, first in his assessment, right? You want to actually see how he's landing in a general term, right? When if this is something where he's landing in a specific way when he's just going up for basic layups in practice, whereas this is something that's only happening to him in game where he's jumping into some of these kind of, these dirty landing zones, that's a complete different spectrum. Because in one case, you have a player who it may be more that proprioceptive aspect that he's dealing with in the air and that decision making. Whereas if you have someone who's always landing in this pattern, regardless of anything, that might just be far more habitual. And so that's going to take right away. That tells me that might take me a little bit more time to deal with. And I have to really break it down all the way back to the beginning, because that's just that person's ingrained pattern, right? And so first for me is figuring out just where that person lies on that spectrum and where that landing issue really comes from. And so, but let's say in Ja's case, let's say he has some landing issues generally, right? Just to make it easy. Even when he's in practice, you're seeing certain things. You're like, maybe we can reduce some risk here. So for me, I'm gonna start with a kind of and you can always come back, and I want you to give your process after this. I'm going to start with a player in a more kind of static environment where I'm having them just jump up and down, and I'm over exaggerating what I want to see. Because what we know with movement is that when you're so used to a pendulum being one way, if you swing the pendulum all the other way in the other direction, in the end, you will end up somewhere in the middle. No matter what, you're never going to get the full extreme, or rarely. So you almost have to swing the pendulum all the way in the other direction, and therefore the player will end up somewhere in the middle. So I'm going to start with more static jumps, whether it's just up and down 2 foot, 1 foot, and then I'll go into other variables, right? Multi-directional. And once I can see that they're adapting to that, then we add other open variables. For example, right, going into basketball specific, and then moving into, okay, how do I add contact in the air to get that person more comfortable with that contact? Okay. And so I'm working on those mechanics. And then the entire time, I think for me, I'm layering in to get the player to understand the risk reward of certain situations. Because for players who have played a long time, and that's just their style of play, it takes a lot of reinforcement for them to change that. And unfortunately, it can often take them getting injured or something happening very negatively for them to change that. And so that's something I'm always hammering that in with players, where I try my best to, or I try to give them examples of why it would help their game to do that.
I think that there's sort of two essential, I guess the two things that I try to do early are identify what the lowest hanging fruit is for players that I may be working with in more of like a training setting, where they're not necessarily like a player who's going to be with me for years and years. I may not have the time to like go all the way back to basics. So it's just like, what is the easiest thing to do for where they are that they can take with them and right. be a tool for them that is just like the lowest level of like the highest impact for the lowest time and energy investment. So for some of them, maybe teaching them avoidance. So like, hey, these are the situations where you're not allowed to jump full speed into somebody, and just watching the film of, these are most of the bad landings you take are in this situation. So let's work on counters out of that situation that don't lead to you trying to dunk or trying to do a contortion finish. And then the second thing is trying to find the most valuable fundamental for them. Usually in the high school guys or in middle school guys that I work with most often, it is that they don't know how they land. Like they just don't think about it. And so doing conscious landing, where, you step off, a small step in air, somebody calls 1 or 2 feet.
Yep. And
they have to just quickly try to get it and land on balance. I mean, for just landing on balance for, most ninth graders is an Olympic event. And so to have an element of challenge to develop that neuromuscular and like intention within landing is a huge development for them, because they've just been like, oh, I fall, like gravity carries me downwards, and I try, to run afterwards. It's not a conscious thing. And that for older players where, guys who have been pros for 5, 6, 7 years or whatever, they're so used to everything in their lives being systematized, where it's like how they eat, how they work out, how, their weight routines, that processing something else is so natural to them. But for younger guys, it can be difficult to just add more onto the plate. So by gamifying it within fundamentals is something that I've found to be very valuable, and something that has had results. I think that like in an ideal world, you'd sort of like walk through all of the basics of landing and walk through, every basic fundamental, but not every 14, 15, 22-year-old is going to, track onto that. And I think that what you said about overdoing movements to develop them is something that I found to be extremely true when teaching ball handling. There was recently a clip that came out of Paul George working with his off-season trainer, and he was working on a hang dribble sidestep, and there was no dribble after the hang. So it was hang, basically cover 3 or 4 steps, pick up the ball, and then 2 steps afterwards. And on the pickup, he would palm the ball to sell the hezzy. So it's hang, like light hezzy sidestep. And it was clearly a travel. but it was being taught to him as a travel so that he could internalize the movement structure, because it is easier for almost everyone who isn't the superhero taskmaster to duplicate something by toning it down from extreme than to go from minimum to turn it up until a value. So with, landing mechanics and movement skills in general, like there is a precedent for this in other areas of basketball and just general sport, but we struggle with it when it comes to these extreme fundamentals that just aren't seen as fundamentals, because it's just not it has not historically been the purview of youth basketball coaches.
Yeah, think about how we develop as a child, right? You develop gross movement patterns first. You're going to have a child who's wobbling around while they're walking. Imagine trying to teach a child fine motor movement right off the bat. Like, oh, I want you to walk and run, with this perfect cadence and this rhythm. Never going to happen. So the way we develop, first we develop kind of a general outline of movement, and it's going to be very, very kind of choppy. It's going to be very rough around the edges. And like you said, then we tune it in. However, for whatever reason, when it comes to movement skills, there's this idea that we have to be, in that fine motor phase immediately. That's a mismatch between how motor movement is actually developed, right? And so the Paul George example is perfect, where he's developing the general kind of sketch of the movement he wants, and then he's filling in the details as he gets that sketch kind of internalized, right? And so, and that's really what the motor science, the movement science shows us, is that fact. And coming back to Ja, and that's again from what we talked about, is that it's teaching him that general kind of sketch of what we're looking for, and then fine tuning it. And that's really the key. And then before we kind of get on to what we're seeing from him this year, one thing I have to mention is that we haven't mentioned yet is that a lot of players now, they have certain physical deficits too. Like, for example, something PD and I have talked about is ankle dorsiflexion mobility. Like that joint, for whatever reason, whether it's due to multiple ankle sprains that weren't addressed and mobility wasn't addressed, they just can't access that ankle dorsiflexion anymore, which then physically does not allow them to do the motion that we want, right? So you have to be able to assess that as well and address it as well. And that's a key part of it, because I can sit here, till the cows come home and say, hey, I want your ankle to do this. But if they physically can't do it, they can't do it.
Yeah. And I think that there is a knock-on effect of like, I call it movement disorders, like sort of like when something is wrong with a player's body, there's a more likelihood that something else is related as an overcompensation here. So if a player has like a really loose ankle, just like one that moves
hypermobile.
Yeah, just like it the player does not have control of it if they're not actively flexing the muscle. Like there's more likely that they're going to have weird knee stuff. It's just like, yeah, you can see how this would cause bad landings. Bad landings would cause extra knee issues, and then extra knee issues probably causes some hip tightness. Like the kinetic chain has these intense relationships, and I think you gracefully elided probably the largest cause of why people's ankles don't move. And I will be ungraceful and say I find it to be most often because players have only played one sport and have never had to do more ankle challenging activities, or ones that would require some unique movement and have sort of can only operate on the go forward plane, or the slight lateral movement plane, is basketball, instead of cleat sports or sports where the foot and the muscles and the toes are being developed, and that single sport focus leads to some of this extreme ankle tightness that we see pretty commonly among youth athletes, especially those that are not in the sub professional tier or the sub professional track. So just your average high school athlete, most likely if they've been in one sport their entire life, has poor ankles because there hasn't been a person to necessarily address them.
No, absolutely. And I think that's a topic that we might do for a future one, because that thing's a whole can of worms right there. And so, but it's very, very important, especially for athletes. It's incredibly important. You could say it's one of the most important topics, and especially for basketball players. And so last thing I want to talk about today, obviously SSS, small sample size with Ja this year, right? But for me personally, there are, even with some of his big jumps, I have seen, even at the tail end, second half of last year, I've seen him improve in certain ways where where before he would land with a lot of that off balance single leg in extension landing, where he still does single leg a lot, but now he's flexing into that knee much more and it's much quicker. So he's absorbing that force. And then secondly, I also see him not always opting for the single leg. Like, for example, there was a dunk he did, I think it was from the opener, where he dunked, he hung on the rim to allow himself to then land on 2 feet and sink back into his hips, rather than just do that Cobra strike dunk, come down full force, right? And that was what we're talking about giving that player that proprioception in the air and making it conscious, like you said.
Yeah. Another valuable point in the hanging on the rim should not be a tech agenda that I've carried for many years. Is just that hanging on the rim punishes no one really. And really, if you wanted to get down to it, it hurts your own team because you can just push and transition afterwards. But it can be a tool that players use to just establish more calm landings. I think that you can almost see at times there's a cued nature to how Ja lands, or you can almost see him thinking whatever the cue is for him, sink into your hips as he's landing, which is a really good sign. And I think leads to my biggest question for you about this topic is that for a person who does not have a background in this, for a person who is really interested, but also understands that God, there are just millions of things I don't know. I only get to see Ja Morant play every 2 or 3 days. And what are the things that I can look for to see how he's developing, or what are the positive signposts, the mile markers of his development as a lander, and what should I most be looking for as the season progresses? You've already noted some good things so far, but what else could he potentially add in his bag? What are some of these coping mechanisms? What could be next?
I think first thing is, coping mechanism wise, is him maybe not even trying to dunk as often, right? In certain situations where he doesn't need to go up for a dunk. I think Blake Griffin learned this the hard way, where he was getting freaking nailed in the air and landing poorly. So I think if you see Ja starting to go away from trying to dunk in every situation, and it's more to the layup aspect, develop that package more, that's going to be one excellent sign for his development. Secondly, something we've talked about multiple times here is just looking at his balance when he's landing. Is he having those one-legged or even two-legged landings where his torso is one way, his legs are the other, right? How is he stacking up when he lands? And then thirdly, another major one is just looking at the mechanics of his legs when he's landing. Is that knee bent? Is that hip bent? And also, fourthly, something you mentioned lastly, when there are certain situations where you can't land right cleanly. How is he doing that landing? Like you mentioned with Westbrook, is he landing on the hip? Is he able to then, transfer force where he lands even on his feet and then falls forward onto his hip or shoulder rather than trying to stay upright? And those are key developments we've seen with a lot of players, is understanding that, hey, I can roll to really transfer a lot of that force out of my body. And I think those 4 key things are really what I'm looking for, from Ja as the season goes on. How about yourself? Kind of, from your perspective, what would you be looking for?
So my background is much more in the coaching and training side. So I think that something that I have seen as a development for skinny guys, or guys that don't necessarily that are trying to tone down their contact, is collecting fouls earlier. So not needing to get hit in air. But trying to pick up ticky-tack things so that there is not a need for a collision. A thing that just generally happens in basketball is that the whistle is blown, everybody stops. And so if it's a continuation foul, people just won't jump. And I find that a lot of his landings are because he's jumping into someone rather than potentially pursuing, or obviously Foulcraft is currently facing an attack from referees. Some of the lean-in stuff is no longer viable, but the hook is still valuable. Collecting those fouls on the ground and then continuing them is still valuable. And I think that just minimizing the amount of in-air collisions both through, Euro stepping around, by saving the dunks that by finding situations where dunking is an option, but not the solution. It is a possible solution, minimizing just the amount of times you hit the dunk button in those situations. It's like, okay, I don't need this one to be a dunk, and saving those 4 times where it's like, the only way I can score here is by trying to bang on this dude.
Yep.
And those are the ones you use. Obviously, you can incorporate the ones in traffic. I think Vince Carter is another name of like learning that. Obviously, his is somewhat injury influenced, and just he's somebody who had some struggles with his landing, and just playing in a different era with a different level of understanding of the impact of people's bodies, or the impact of basketball and flying on people's bodies. But he certainly learned to save when he needed to get up for the right moment. And I think that this gayness is really important for him, that adding, years and years of core development are going to be really essential. So he doesn't get knocked off balance as often. Those are the most dangerous ones generally, are the ones where you're in air and you get bumped slightly, and now you have to redefine your balance. And sometimes you cannot do so before you hit the ground. So it's sort of landing and being on balance at the same time, and it being safe. And those are sort of the compounding of those problems are the ones that are more likely to have an additional burden on the body, and minimizing that is going to be essential. And that's all stuff about pickup points, about early fouls, about leaning into craft. I mean, you can go into spacing. All of these things are related. That's going to be a theme of this show, is that there is a natural tendency to want to corral expertise, to say like, oh yeah, this is a podcast about movement skills, but like these all play a part to, like, if you don't call Iverson so much and he's not coming off the specific screen, there's less likely that he has a difficult angle for a finish at a 45-degree angle. And those are the ones we're trying to avoid. And instead, crafting better driving lanes for him through play calls, through skill development, through pace, like that. There is an interrelationship between all of these, and a connectivity that I think needs to be emphasized and needs to be brought to bear, because none of these things exist in a vacuum, and can be developed by a collaboration between all elements of a basketball organization.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? Like, if you don't want him to jump into more people, then you create a play where he's going to have a cleaner lane to go into, right? And so it's everyone's involved in this process. And I think that's something we're really trying to deconstruct, is that, landing mechanics aren't just a mechanical thing, or, it's something, there's a domino effect from every piece of the puzzle. And that's something we really want to pull back. And I think one last thing I want to touch on is something that we'll get into in later episodes that Ja could use more often. I've seen him use rather than his normal 2-leg jump, he does sometimes use a quicker 1-leg speed jump, which allows him, is a lot more fluid. He doesn't get quite as high vertically, but it limits the ground force through him. So potentially, could he develop that into something he's using within the half court system more often? Yeah, potentially, right? So that could also be another thing that he could work on. But again, that's another topic we can touch on. But for now, again, I want to say thanks for joining us for the first episode. For my stuff, you can find me at 3CB Performance, 3 Charlie Beta Performance, Twitter, YouTube. Love answering questions. And then PD Web, go ahead and exit us out of here.
Thank you guys for this first episode. I mean, this is a project that I am so excited to be a part of. I'm so excited that you are carrying me along on this, that I am wildly underqualified, and hope that I can bring some kind of value here. If you are interested in my work, you can find my writing on Patreon. The work is always free. The link to that is on my Twitter, which is above the break 3. The work on Patreon is always free. If you can toss me a couple bucks, it'd be much appreciated. I have streams that are all on YouTube. Again, the link is on the Patreon. It's breakdowns of players, breakdowns of draft prospects, philosophy streams talking about the nature of development, and probably do some more historical stuff for historical draft prospects in the coming weeks as the season starts to kick off. I also work for Cerebro Sports, a analytics company focused on box scores and building a more global understanding of the game, where I do consulting and data metrics and stuff like that. If that sounds so interesting, holler at your boy. But again, thank you so much. Thank you for the people who listened along. Really excited about this and excited to cover a lot of topics that I think people have been curious about, but Googling, it might not be the easiest thing. And even when you do, you might get a little bit more technical answers. So yeah, accessibility, education, fun. That's the goal.
That's true. You know, when in doubt, WebMD is always helpful. Your best friend. All right, guys. All right, we'll catch y'all next week. And again, thanks for joining us.